6 true scary stories from Reddit that will leave you terrified. It was just another ordinary evening. One of those quiet, uneventful nights where everything seemed to blend together. The kind of night where you feel safe, the world outside a distant hum, and all that's left is the soft glow of your computer screen and the rhythm of your own thoughts. The sound of clicking keys echoed through the room as I sat at my desk, scrolling mindlessly through Reddit, my eyes skimming over post after post of memes, news updates, and random threads that made up the usual background noise of my evening. As the night wore on, I found myself drifting, the screen a blur of words. But then, something caught my attention, a thread titled True Scary Stories. The title alone made me pause. It wasn't one of the usual clickbait titles that seem to be everywhere these days. No, this one felt different. The promise of real, terrifying experiences, shared by actual people who had lived through the kind of horror that you only read about in fiction, drew me in. I clicked. At first, there was nothing unusual. Just a regular flurry of responses from other users, a few humorous comments, and the occasional emoji. But as I began to scroll through the stories, I could feel the air around me shift. The comfortable weight of the night seemed to grow heavier, the space around me narrowing, as if something was shifting just out of sight. The normality of my evening, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car driving by outside, began to fade into the background, overshadowed by the chilling stories I was reading. I kept reading. Each story grew more unsettling than the last, the realness of it all sinking in with every sentence. The experiences shared were not those of distant strangers. They were personal, raw, unnerving. People were telling their stories of encounters with the unexplainable, of moments when the ordinary became the extraordinary, when fear began creeping into the smallest, most mundane aspects of life. The more I read, the more I felt my own heart rate quicken, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It wasn't just the content of the stories, but the feeling that came with them, the sense that something was watching, waiting, that the very act of reading them was drawing me into a web of unease, a world where the line between reality and nightmare was thinner than I'd ever imagined. And as I continued scrolling, I couldn't shake the thought, what if this was happening to someone, somewhere right now? What if it was happening to me? As I stared at the screen, my mind wandered to places it hadn't gone in years. The room around me, once familiar and comforting, began to feel foreign, as though I wasn't truly alone. A soft creak from the hallway made me jump. The clock ticked louder, and with every second, the stories grew more real, more alive in my mind. The comfort of an average evening had been shattered. I couldn't stop reading, and with each story, I couldn't help but feel like the night was growing darker, shadows in my room lengthening, as if I too had become part of the story, one of those real, terrifying accounts that someone else would read, hoping it would be nothing more than a bad dream. But I knew better. These were real, and the more I read, the more I realized that I was no longer simply a passive observer. I was a part of something far darker than I'd ever imagined. Story 1. Dubai Airport Nightmare. Wrongful detention. The moment I stepped off the plane, the heat of Dubai hit me like a wall. It was a dry, suffocating warmth, different from anything I had ever felt before. The airport, gleaming with polished marble floors and towering glass walls, was a marvel of modernity. But the air, thick with the hum of travelers and the sterile scent of fresh coffee and expensive cologne, was strangely impersonal. People moved in a blur, their faces blank, as if this was just another stop on a conveyor belt, each individual a cog in an unfeeling machine. I had arrived for a business trip. Nothing too glamorous, just a series of meetings with clients, a bit of small talk, and an eventual return home. But as I passed through the grand halls of Dubai International, something felt off. A subtle unease crept in, but I dismissed it as nothing more than jet lag. My mind was occupied with the task at hand, collecting my bag, heading to the hotel, and preparing for the meetings ahead. The first sign that something was wrong came when I reached immigration. The line moved slowly, but that was to be expected. I watched people ahead of me shuffle their documents, the indifferent faces of the officers as they stamped passports with mechanical precision. But when I reached the counter, the officer's eyes lingered a little too long on my paperwork. "Please step aside," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. I felt my heart skip. A knot of anxiety formed in my stomach, but I didn't voice my concern. I simply nodded, wondering if this was just a routine check, a delay in the system. But when I was led away from the line and towards a side room, my pulse quickened. The room was cold and stark, walls painted a dull beige, the light overhead harsh and unforgiving. There was no explanation, no apology for the inconvenience, just silence and the cold buzz of fluorescent lights. "Sit here," a different officer said, gesturing to a chair in front of a large metal desk. I complied, trying to remain calm, but inside I was already unraveling. My mind raced. Was this a security issue? Had I made a mistake with my documents? I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, just a bureaucratic hiccup. But as the minutes dragged on, I began to feel something else, the chilling sensation of being trapped. Hours passed. At least it felt like hours. My throat grew dry, and I struggled to maintain my composure. Every time the door opened, I braced myself for someone to explain what was happening, but no one did. Instead, another officer would enter, eyeing me with suspicion, asking the same questions over and over. "Where are you going? What is your business here? Why are you traveling with these documents?" The questions were harmless on their own, but the repetition began to gnaw at me. The officers were polite, but their detachment made everything feel more sinister. There was no anger in their voices, no threat, but the unyielding silence between their questions was unsettling. They weren't trying to get answers. They were trying to make me doubt myself. Each time I answered, they would look at me as if something was wrong, as if I had said something that didn't quite add up. The unease that had simmered at the back of my mind exploded in a full-blown panic. Was I being accused of something? Was I a criminal? I tried to remain calm, but the walls seemed to close in around me. I could feel my breath growing shallow, my mind spinning in circles as I replayed every detail of my trip, every interaction I had had. Had I done something wrong? Had I unknowingly crossed a line? It wasn't until much later that I was told the cause of the confusion. A mix-up, a simple error in the system. It turned out that my documents had been flagged by mistake. A miscommunication that in any other country might have been cleared up with a phone call or a brief exchange. But here, in this cold, unfeeling place, it had become something much more than a misunderstanding. I was told that I was free to go, but the damage had already been done. The sense of powerlessness, the feeling that I had been caught in a web of bureaucracy and authoritarian control, clung to me long after I left the sterile room. I walked through the airport, feeling the weight of every stare, every glance, as if everyone around me knew what had happened. I had been detained for something I hadn't done, treated like a criminal for a mistake I didn't even understand. As I boarded the train to my hotel, I looked back at the gleaming facade of the airport. It was beautiful, pristine even, but behind its luxurious exterior, there was a darkness, a reminder that even in the heart of modern wealth and technological advancement, the individual could be crushed by a simple mistake. A mistake that, in a place like this, could lead to something far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. The horror wasn't just a mistake. It was the realization that I was completely at the mercy of an invisible system, one that operated on its own rules, indifferent to the lives it affected. And in that moment, I understood something unsettling. Even in a place that prided itself on control and perfection, there was always the potential for everything to go wrong. And when it did, no one would care. The fear lingered long after I left Dubai, a dark reminder that the true terror often lies not in what is tangible, but in the systems, the rules, and the forces beyond our control. Story 2. The Stalker Who Wouldn't Let Go. I never thought my life would become one of those stories. You know, the ones where someone gets caught up in a toxic relationship that spirals into something they never could have imagined. I always believed that if I made good decisions, if I listened to the right people, I'd be safe from anything dark or frightening. But I was wrong. What began as a normal relationship a little awkward at first, blossomed into something that made me question everything I knew about trust, love, and even reality. It started like any other relationship. We met at work. His name was Daniel, a quiet guy, kind of shy, but he had this way of looking at me that felt like I was the only person in the room. He was attentive, sweet, and seemed so earnest about everything. At first, I didn't think much of it. A guy showing interest in me? I didn't exactly have men lining up for me, so I figured, why not give it a shot? We started dating, and for a while it felt like a dream. I was happy. He was happy. We were just like any other couple, until we weren't. The first sign of trouble didn't come immediately. It came quietly, like the rustle of leaves before the storm. Daniel began showing up unexpectedly at my favorite cafe, at the bookstore I frequented. He claimed it was a coincidence. I just thought I'd surprise you, he said, smiling awkwardly, but there was something about the way he smiled that made me uneasy. Still, I told myself it was harmless. Cared, right? He wanted to see me, but it was just the beginning. The signs got harder to ignore after the breakup. It was a mutual decision. He was too clingy, I was too independent. I had tried to end it gently, explaining how I needed space to focus on myself, on my future. He took it well, or so I thought. It didn't take long for things to turn. At first, it was the occasional text to "How are you?" or "I miss you." I tried to be polite, to let him down easy, but as time passed, the messages became more desperate, more pleading. I told him I needed distance, but he didn't listen. It wasn't until I started receiving handwritten notes that were left on my car windshield, tucked under the door of my apartment, that I realized something was wrong. The notes were innocuous at first, just vague, unsettling lines that made me feel uneasy. "I miss you more than you'll ever know. You were the best thing that ever happened to me." At first, I tried to brush them off, thinking they were just remnants of his feelings, that he'd soon move on. But as the weeks passed, the notes became darker. "I know where you work. You can't hide from me." I began to feel his presence in every corner of my life. He started showing up at my workplace. At first, it was a brief glance outside my office window or the sound of his voice in the hallway when I least expected it. But soon it was much worse. One afternoon, I turned around to see him standing in the doorway, smiling like he had every right to be there. I nearly screamed, "What are you doing here?" I demanded. His face was calm, almost serene, but his eyes, the way they locked onto mine like he was studying me, measuring my every reaction, made my skin crawl. "I just thought I'd check in," he said softly, his voice too calm, too familiar. "See how you're doing." I felt trapped. This wasn't the man I'd once known. The man who had been sweet, eager, respectful. This was something different. This was a stranger wearing his face, but with an unholy obsession that I couldn't shake. My heart raced as I backed away. "You need to leave." But it didn't end there. Soon, I was getting phone calls. They were always from blocked numbers, the voice on the other end low and distorted, but unmistakable. "I see you," he would say. "I'm watching." His words would hang in the air long after the call ended, chilling me to the bone. I would drop the phone, my hands trembling, but the fear didn't go away. It lingered, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I changed my number, blocked him on social media, even went so far as to switch apartments. But it didn't matter. He always seemed to know. My new address? He showed up at my door with flowers in hand, smiling like everything was fine, like he was still the man I had known. My stomach churned with dread, but I couldn't make sense of it. How could he find me so easily? Was I being followed? Was I being watched? The worst part of it all was the gifts. At first, they seemed harmless enough. An old book I'd once mentioned liking, a box of chocolates I had a weakness for. But then they became strange, personal, items I'd never mentioned to him, things that were too intimate, too invasive. A necklace with my initials engraved, a photograph of me from my college graduation, the one I'd only shared with close friends. How'd he get these things? How had he been so close, without me ever knowing? The line between my reality and my paranoia began to blur. I couldn't trust my own instincts anymore. I began questioning everything. Was he really watching me when I went out? When I took the subway home? Was I being followed when I went to the grocery store? The simple act of leaving my apartment became an ordeal. Every noise, every glance in my direction felt like an omen. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. There was no one to turn to. The police, when I finally went to them, were kind but unhelpful. Without evidence, they said, "There's nothing we can do." They told me to be cautious, to avoid confrontation, but they couldn't protect me from his eyes. He was everywhere. Everywhere I went, his presence was there, like a dark cloud following me, suffocating me. I began to lose my sense of safety. Every creak in the floorboards, every knock at the door was him in my mind. The world, once full of light and possibilities, had turned into a maze of shadows. And the worst part, I was beginning to wonder if I was going crazy. Was it all in my head, or was this really happening? The question hung in the air like a ghost, and I couldn't answer it. I tried everything I could think of to break free. Therapy, new friends, even a temporary move to another city. But the haunting feeling never went away. It became a part of my life, like a sickness that wouldn't let go, a knot in my stomach that never loosened. I don't know if it was the stalking that broke me or the isolation that came with it, but slowly, surely, I started to lose pieces of myself. I couldn't live my life anymore. Every day was just a cycle of fear, an endless loop of looking over my shoulder and wondering, is he watching me right now? In the end, I learned the hardest lesson of all, that when someone becomes obsessed with you, it's not just your life that's at risk. It's your reality, your sense of safety, and your peace of mind. And no matter how far you run, no matter how many walls you put up, there will always be a part of you that knows you'll never truly be free. Because once someone has fixed their gaze upon you, once they've made you their focus, there's nowhere to hide. Story 3, creepy neighbors and a burglary gone wrong. It was supposed to be the fresh start we needed. My husband, James, and I had spent years dreaming of this moment. The day we'd finally leave the city and settle into a quieter life. A house in the countryside, far from the noise and chaos of urban life, where we could escape the rush and just be together. We had found a perfect little fixer-upper in a sleepy rural town, a small community where everyone seemed to know each other, and the neighbors always waved as they passed by. It felt safe. It felt peaceful. The house itself was old, full of character, but it needed work. So we spent our days ripping up old carpets, sanding down worn wooden floors, and fixing the creaking windows. I loved it. Every moment felt like an investment in our future. We even started to dream about the years ahead. Summer barbecues, long walks in the countryside, maybe even starting a family. We couldn't have been happier. The house felt like ours, and the neighborhood felt like home. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when things began to change. James had just finished putting in a new door frame when we heard a faint knock at the door. I opened it to find our neighbor, Mr. Foster, standing on the porch, holding a tin of homemade cookies. A kind gesture, I thought. He was an older man, always polite, with a way of smiling that never quite reached his eyes. He lived next door, and over the past few weeks, we'd exchanged pleasantries, nothing more. His wife, a reclusive woman named Eleanor, stayed mostly inside, but every now and then, I'd see her peering out the window, watching us. "Thought you might enjoy these," Mr. Foster said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's been a while since I baked. You'll be needing the energy for all that work you've been doing." He nodded toward the piles of tools and discarded paint cans in our yard. "Thanks, Mr. Foster. That's kind of you," I said, feeling the usual unease that came with his overly attentive gaze. As I reached for the tin, I noticed something that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. His eyes lingered too long on my wrist. The watch I had just inherited from my grandmother was missing. It wasn't on my wrist anymore. I had taken it off earlier, leaving it on the kitchen counter while I worked on sanding the walls. "Did you see my watch on the counter?" I asked, suddenly feeling cold. He smiled again, but this time the smile seemed different, strained. "No, can't say I've noticed," he replied almost too quickly. "But, I'll leave you to your work. Enjoy the cookies." He walked away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that evening, when James and I were sitting down to dinner, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was the sheriff. He looked uneasy, like he didn't want to be there. "Evening, folks. Sorry to disturb you," he said, adjusting his belt. I just wanted to inform you that there was a break-in nearby last night. Didn't take anything major, but I thought you should know." I froze. "A break-in?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah," he continued, "but don't worry. It was a small robbery, a quick in and out. Probably just some kids looking to cause trouble." He shifted his weight uncomfortably. "We've been keeping an eye on things, but it's always good to be aware, you know?" I nodded, my mind racing. A small robbery. That was what he said. But as the sheriff left, something gnawed at me. How could he have known so much about it? The sheriff had acted like this was the first he'd heard of it, but there was no mention of the specifics, things that only someone who knew us would have noticed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. I kept hearing small creaks and whispers, like the walls themselves were speaking. Was it just my imagination, or was something off about the way the shadows shifted? I decided to get up and check the house, make sure everything was locked tight. As I crept downstairs, I noticed something out of place. My purse was sitting on the kitchen table, slightly open. My wallet, along with a few other items, was missing. I froze. We had been careful about locking everything. I had checked twice before going to bed. I ran to the living room and grabbed my phone, dialing James' number. He was still awake, sitting in the den, and when he answered, I could hear the panic in my voice. "James, I think someone's been in the house." "What are you talking about?" "It's just the two of us here," he said, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "James, the purse, the wallet, everything's gone. The door was locked, but something feels wrong." I heard him muttering on the other end, getting up to come check the house. Just then, I heard a knock at the door. Soft, hesitant. My heart dropped into my stomach. Who could it be at this hour? I looked through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door slowly, expecting to find no one, but there, standing in the shadows, was Mr. Foster. "Again, I thought I heard someone moving around in there," he said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Hope everything's okay." I stared at him for a moment, unable to process what he was saying. How did he know I was in the kitchen? How did he know I was still awake? There was no way he could have seen me from the window. And yet, there he was. "We're fine," I said stiffly, trying to hide the shaking in my voice. "Thank you." But before I could close the door, he added something that sent a chill down my spine. "You've been leaving your windows unlocked lately. You should be careful," he said with a strange, knowing smile. I slammed the door shut, feeling my heart race. There was no way he could have known about the windows unless he'd been watching us. The next morning, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood, hoping to clear my head. I passed by Mr. Foster's house and stopped dead in my tracks. His lawn was immaculate as always, but there was something strange about the window on the second floor. It was slightly ajar, the curtain blowing gently in the wind. It wasn't unusual to leave a window open in the heat, but as I stared at it, something inside me twisted with fear. Had he been watching us for longer than I thought? Was he the one behind the break-in? Or was it someone else, someone who knew exactly how to get to us, someone who had been waiting for the right moment? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that nothing about this town, about this house, felt safe anymore. The renovations, the peaceful countryside, it was all a facade. The cracks were starting to show, and I couldn't ignore them. I couldn't ignore him. As the days went on, James and I found more things out of place, small things, mostly, but they kept adding up. A light left on that we never turned on, tools missing from the garage, items shifting, almost like someone had been going through our things when we weren't looking. And each time we confronted the neighbors, they would act like nothing was wrong, like it was all just part of living in a small town. But I knew better now. I knew that we weren't just living in a house. We were living under constant surveillance. And the worst part was, I couldn't figure out who the real threat was anymore. Was it Mr. Foster, with his unsettling smile and his two knowing eyes? Or was it someone else? Someone who was even closer than we realized? In the end, I couldn't stay in the house anymore. The feeling of being watched had become unbearable. We packed up and left, but even now, I can't shake the feeling that the shadows in that town still know my name. And wherever we go next, no matter how far, I'll never truly feel safe again. Story 4. The unmarked package and the malfunctioning security cameras. It was supposed to be just another typical Wednesday morning. The sun was barely rising. casting a soft golden glow over the neat rows of suburban homes. The birds were already out, chirping their way through the quiet neighborhood. I had just finished my cup of coffee and was scrolling through my phone, checking emails before heading out to work. There was nothing special about the morning, nothing that would indicate how quickly everything was about to change. I lived alone in a modest 2-story house at the edge of a quiet suburban street. The neighborhood was the kind that seemed too perfect, where everyone knew everyone else and things were always just a little too pristine. I had moved here a few months ago, looking for a fresh start after a rough breakup. It felt like a safe place, a retreat from the noise and chaos of the city. My house was cozy, with large windows that let in plenty of light, and a backyard where I could escape and have some privacy. For all intents and purposes, it was ideal. That morning, as I walked past the front door, I noticed something unusual, a package. It was sitting on the doorstep, unmarked with no return address, just a plain cardboard box. My first instinct was to ignore it. We rarely receive packages, and if it was something important, surely they would have left a note or tried calling me. But something about the way it was placed made me hesitate. It wasn't like any delivery I had received before. The manila tape was worn, the box was scuffed and dented, as though it had been through something, or someone had handled it too many times. I stood there for a moment, looking at it. The stillness of the morning fell off, like there was something beneath the surface. I quickly checked my phone to see if I had missed a notification about a delivery, but there was nothing. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic down the street, and even that felt muffled, as though the world had gone quieter somehow. I debated leaving the package there and walking away, but curiosity got the better of me. I bent down, picking it up cautiously. The weight of it surprised me. It was heavier than it looked, solid and compact. No label, no return address, just nothing. I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, but I brushed it off as paranoia. Who wouldn't be curious about an unexpected package? When I brought it inside, I set it down on the kitchen table, my heart still beating a little faster than usual. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. I looked around the room as if expecting someone to be hiding in the shadows, but there was no one. I was alone. With a sigh, I grabbed a knife from the drawer and cut through the tape. Inside was a mess of packing peanuts, and beneath them, another box, this one wrapped in faded brown paper. I unwrapped it slowly, hands trembling just a little, as if my body could sense something I couldn't quite articulate. The second box was small, no more than 6 inches wide. It felt oddly cold to the touch, almost like it had been stored in a freezer. The brown paper crinkled as I peeled it back, revealing a small black notebook, its cover cracked and stained with something dark, almost like ink, but thicker, darker. My skin prickled as I stared at it, trying to make sense of it. What was this? What did it mean? I almost didn't want to open it, but my fingers trembled with a mixture of fear and intrigue, and before I could stop myself, I flipped the cover open. The pages inside were filled with drawings, unsettling sketches of people. Their faces were distorted, twisted into shapes that didn't look human, their eyes hollow and empty. The more I flipped through, the more the drawings seemed to shift, as though they were moving, changing. I felt my heart race, my breathing shallow. I slammed the book shut and quickly shoved it back into its box. I needed to get rid of it, throw it out, but I had a nagging feeling I couldn't ignore. As I stood there, my mind reeling, I heard a soft beep from the corner of the room. The small security camera in my living room, the one I'd set up just to feel safe, blinked red. A warning. It malfunctioned from time to time, but this felt different. I glanced at the small screen attached to it, but nothing was there, just static. I frowned, reaching over to reset it, but when I tapped the button, the screen flickered and went black. I walked to the front door to check the security system's control panel. The entire system was offline. My pulse quickened. That wasn't right. I had tested it just yesterday. Everything had been working fine. I checked the other cameras, the ones at the back of the house, the side yard. All of them had the same issue. They were completely blank. It was as if they had been shut off remotely, or worse, tampered with. I felt the floor beneath me shift, the world around me starting to feel wrong. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty screens, the silence swallowing me whole. And then, as if I had been waiting for it, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation that I was being watched. I wasn't alone anymore. I rushed to the window, pulling the blinds aside just enough to peer outside, but saw nothing. The street was empty, the houses across the way still and silent. But the feeling wouldn't go away. My stomach twisted in knots, my limbs frozen with dread. Someone had been in my house. Someone had been watching me, and I didn't know who they were or how they had gotten in. I had no control over this. I grabbed my phone, dialing the police, but as I brought the phone to my ear, I noticed something else. The time on the screen was wrong. The numbers were all jumbled, as if they had been manipulated. My hand shook as I hung up the phone, the realization hitting me like a cold wave. Whoever had done this, they knew what they were doing. They had access to my home, to my cameras, to my phone. They had been watching me, and now they were waiting for me to make the next move. I couldn't stop trembling as I thought of the notebook, of the disturbing drawings, of the fact that I was no longer alone in my own home. The walls, once so familiar, now seemed like a cage, and the silence felt like a trap. The house that had once been my safe haven was now a place of fear, filled with the unknown, filled with the undeniable truth that someone or something was watching. The security cameras, the package, the drawings, I couldn't escape any of it. I wasn't safe, and I was left with one horrifying thought. What was waiting for me next? Story 5, the mugging that didn't end. It was supposed to be a normal evening, just a quick trip to grab some dinner before heading home. I had just finished my shift at the cafe and was walking through downtown, the cool evening air brushing against my skin. The city felt alive, the streets bustling with people. The hum of conversations and the glow of streetlights seemed almost comforting. But it wasn't until I turned down that one dark alley that everything changed. I didn't see him at first. He came out of nowhere, stepping from the shadows as though he had been waiting there just for me. The moment he grabbed my arm, my heart slammed against my chest, my breath caught in my throat. I turned to face him, and my stomach dropped when I saw his expression, cold, emotionless, almost mechanical. He was well-dressed, sharply tailored suit, expensive shoes. He looked out of place in the alley, like he was playing a part in some twisted theater. "Give me your wallet," he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. I froze, caught off guard. I had seen muggers on the news, heard stories, but I never thought it would happen to me. I did as he asked, fumbling for my wallet in a panic. My mind raced, my thoughts disjointed. The phone in my pocket felt like a lifeline, my only connection to the world, but I knew better than to make a move for it. He didn't need to say it, but I could see the warning in his eyes. "Don't try anything." I handed him the wallet and my phone. He took them without a word, his fingers brushing against mine. It felt like a violation, but that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was the way he looked at me, like he was studying me, memorizing my every move. As he turned to leave, I thought maybe I could breathe again. Maybe it was over. Then I heard him speak again. "Don't forget this." I turned just in time to see him toss a small slip of paper onto the ground near my feet. It fluttered in the air, falling softly to the concrete. I hesitated for a moment, too terrified to even look at it. But curiosity gnawed at me, and against my better judgment, I reached down and grabbed it. The paper was stiff, like it had been folded too many times. I opened it carefully, feeling the weight of each movement. On it, written in sharp, precise handwriting, was a phone number. The digits stared back at me like a warning, like an invitation to something I wasn't ready for. I looked up, but he was already gone, swallowed by the shadows. I stood there for a moment, completely still, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The phone number in my hand burned against my skin, a reminder that this wasn't over. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or terrified, but I was certain of one thing: he wasn't done with me. The next few days were a blur. I filed a police report, told my friends and family about what happened, and tried to act like everything was fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time I looked at my phone, every time I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushed against that slip of paper. It was always there, waiting, a constant presence in the back of my mind. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence in my apartment. I could hear the distant sounds of cars passing, the occasional bark of a dog, but every little noise made my pulse spike. I kept thinking about that number. What was it? Why had he left it for me? Was it a threat or just some twisted game? I told myself I was overreacting, that I was just letting the fear get to me, but I couldn't help it. There were moments when I would catch myself staring at the phone number like it had a power over me, like it was calling to me. I wanted to destroy it, to burn the paper and forget it ever existed. But something held me back. Maybe it was the thought that if I threw it away, if I erased it from my life, it would come back to haunt me even more. I started to notice strange things after that. The faintest feeling that I was being watched, like someone was standing just outside my line of sight. At work, I'd glance up and catch someone looking at me from across the room, their eyes quickly darting away when I made eye contact. It was always brief, but it was enough to make me wonder if they knew, if they were watching me too. And then one night, a week after the mugging, it happened. I was sitting in my car, parked in front of my apartment building, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to steady my breathing. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, and I reached for it instinctively, my heart skipping when I saw the unknown number flashing on the screen. I knew who it was before I even picked it up. I didn't answer it. Instead, I just sat there, my fingers trembling as I looked at the screen. The phone call went to voicemail, and for a long time, I just stared at the number, waiting for the next step, waiting for something to happen. The voicemail was empty, no words, no sound, just silence. But the silence spoke volumes. I felt a chill run down my spine as I hung up the phone, my breath shallow. That was the moment when I realized that I was never going to be free of him. The mugging was only the beginning. The phone number wasn't just a reminder. It was a tether, an invisible string that connected me to him. I was caught in his web, whether I liked it or not. I deleted the number from my phone, hoping that would be the end of it. But the terror lingered. The phone calls kept coming. Late at night, early in the morning, always from different numbers, always silent. I would never know when he would strike next or how long it would take for him to show up again. But deep down, I knew he wasn't done with me. I wasn't sure what he wanted or why he had picked me, but it didn't matter. I had crossed the line, and now I had to live with the consequences. Every day was a countdown to the next encounter. Every knock on my door, every unfamiliar face I passed in the street, felt like another chance for him to appear. The mugging didn't end. It never would. It was only the beginning, and I was trapped, forever waiting for the next chapter of this nightmare to unfold. Story 6. Years of Fear. The Stalker Who Knew Too Much. It began when I was 15. At first, it was subtle, too subtle for anyone to believe me. A pair of eyes in the crowd that lingered too long. A sense of being followed that I couldn't shake. A shadow I could never quite catch. I told my parents, my friends, anyone who would listen, but they all said the same thing. You're imagining it. Maybe I was at first. Maybe the feeling of someone's presence behind me was just a trick of the mind. An overactive imagination fed by late-night crime shows. But then the first photo arrived. It was tucked neatly inside my locker at school. No envelope, no note. Just a single glossy print of me walking home the night before. I was in mid-stride, head down, completely unaware that a camera had captured me in that moment. I showed the photo to my mom, who frowned but waved it off as a prank. Kids these days, she said, her voice dismissive. It's probably one of your friends trying to spook you. But it wasn't a friend. The photos kept coming, always in places where I felt safe. At school, in my bedroom, at the diner where I worked weekends. They were candid, intimate, invasive. One showed me brushing my teeth at night, my reflection caught in the bathroom mirror. Another was taken as I slept, the faint outline of my face barely visible in the dim light. By the time I turned 18, the photos had escalated to something more sinister. They weren't just of me anymore. They were of my family, my friends. My younger brother on his bike, my best friend laughing at the park, my mom unloading groceries. The message was clear. No one in my life was off limits. I stopped telling people. No one believed me anyway. I deleted my social media, avoided public places, and kept my blinds shut tight. But it didn't matter. Somehow, the photos kept coming, slipping under my door or left on the windshield of my car. Years passed, and the fear became a part of me, like a scar that never fully healed. I learned to live with it, though I never stopped looking over my shoulder. The photos came less frequently, but they never stopped entirely. By the time I was in my late 20s, they were a grim reminder that my life was not entirely my own. And then, one day, everything changed. It was a Sunday morning when I found the package on my doorstep. It was larger than usual, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. My stomach churned as I brought it inside, my hands trembling as I set it on the kitchen table. Inside was a stack of photos, thicker than I expected. They were different this time, older, grainier. I flipped through them, my breath catching in my throat as I recognized myself in each one. They were from my childhood. There I was at the park on my 6th birthday, my face smeared with cake. There I was at my school play in 2nd grade, wearing a crooked crown. There I was riding my first bike, my dad steadying the handlebars. Whoever this was, they hadn't just been watching me for years. They had been watching me my entire life. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note, scrawled in jagged letters. "You don't remember me, but I've always been here." The words sent a chill through me. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and no amount of searching my memory brought clarity. Who could it be? A neighbor? A family friend? A stranger who had somehow become entangled in my life without my knowledge? I started sleeping with the lights on. I installed more locks on my doors, more cameras around my house. But the sense of safety was an illusion. Every time I checked the footage, there was nothing there. No movement, no signs of tampering. And yet, the photos kept arriving. The final straw came 6 months later. I was cleaning out my attic, trying to distract myself from the paranoia, when I found a box tucked into the corner, covered in dust. It wasn't mine. Inside the box were more photos. Hundreds of them. Some were old, black and white, faded with time. But others were recent, taken just days or weeks earlier. Each one was labeled on the back with dates and locations, meticulously organized. The realization hit me like a freight train. They had been in my house. I called the police, of course. They came, took the box as evidence, and promised to investigate. But weeks passed, then months, and nothing came of it. The photos stopped for a while, and I dared to hope it was over. Until last week. I woke up to find a single photo taped to my bathroom mirror. It was of me, asleep in my bed, taken just hours earlier. This time, there was no note, no explanation. Just the photo, staring back at me like a mocking reminder that no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to forget, they would always know where to find me. And now, as I sit here writing this, I can't help but glance at the shadows outside my window, wondering if they're out there right now, watching, waiting, because deep down I know the truth. They've never left. They've always been here, and they always will be. The room fell silent after the final story, each tale lingering in the air like a thick, oppressive fog. 6 accounts of terror, each one disturbingly real, threaded together by a common theme: the horrifying fragility of our sense of safety. The protagonist, now a silhouette against the dim light of a dying fire, stared into the distance. Their voice, steady but haunted, broke the silence. These stories aren't about monsters or ghosts. They began, the weight of the words hanging heavy. They're about people, ordinary people, victims, and perpetrators. That's what makes them terrifying. The tales of the unmarked package, the neighborly betrayal, and the mugging that led to years of torment weren't mere anecdotes of fear. They were reflections of the hidden cracks in the veneer of modern life. The protagonist looked around the room, locking eyes with each listener, as if searching for an unspoken understanding. In each of these stories, the victims were just like us, they continued, living their lives, unaware of the shadows creeping closer. Technology, community, even their own homes, none of it could protect them from the invasion of their lives. The truth was a bitter pill to swallow. Our hyper-connected world, designed for convenience and safety, has become a double-edged sword. The same tools that let us stay in touch with loved ones or share memories are the ones that can be turned against us. Surveillance cameras that malfunction at the wrong moment. social media posts that reveal too much, doors locked but not impenetrable. The scariest thing isn't the incidents themselves, the protagonist said, their voice softer now, almost a whisper. It's the realization that anyone, at any time, could become a target. That no matter how careful we are, someone out there can find a way in. A heavy pause filled the room, as each listener shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Vulnerability is the great equalizer, the protagonist continued. It doesn't matter who you are, where you live, or how much you prepare. All it takes is one determined person, someone lurking just out of sight, someone who sees you when you think you're alone, and everything you thought was safe is shattered. The stories had done their job. They weren't just tales of horror. They were warnings, chilling reminders of the darkness that can creep into the most mundane aspects of life. As the fire died completely, plunging the room into near darkness, the protagonist delivered their final words. "Take this as a lesson," they said, their voice cutting through the silence. "Be vigilant. Pay attention. Don't let yourself be lulled into a false sense of security. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's lurking in the shadows. It's realizing how little control we have over our own safety." The room remained silent as the weight of those words settled. Each listener felt the paranoia creeping in, the awareness of their own vulnerability sharpening like a blade. The world outside seemed darker, more menacing, as if the shadows themselves were alive. And as the protagonist stood and left the room, their silhouettes swallowed by the night, the final, unspoken question lingered in every mind. Who might be watching, even now?